I canceled my family's $31,000 Switzerland trip after they posted just the close ones without me. But before you think I'm the villain in this story, let me tell you exactly what led to that moment. It started with an Instagram notification on a Tuesday morning that would change everything I thought I knew about the people I loved most. Hey everyone, I'm Hallie, and I need to tell you about the moment my entire world turned upside down. You know those moments when you think you know your family, when you believe you understand where you stand with the people you love most? Well, I'm about to share a story that will make you question everything about trust, family loyalty, and what happens when the people who are supposed to love you most see you as nothing more than a human ATM. Before I tell you what happened, you need to understand something about my family dynamic. For the past 5 years, ever since I landed my job as a software engineer at a tech company in Denver, I became what you might call the family safety net. It started small, covering my brother Ryan's car insurance when he was between jobs, helping with my parents' mortgage, when Dad's construction business hit a rough patch during the pandemic. I thought I was being a good daughter, a good sister. I thought this was what families did for each other. But looking back now, I can see the pattern that I was blind to for so long. Every family gathering, every phone call, every text message somehow circled back to money. Mom would casually mention how expensive groceries had gotten. Dad would sigh about rising gas prices, and Ryan would joke about being a broke college student. But these weren't just casual conversations. They were carefully orchestrated fishing expeditions, testing the waters to see how much they could ask for next. Last Christmas, I spent over $8,000 on gifts alone. Not because I'm materialistic, but because every hint, every comment, every "oh, I wish I could afford" was met with me opening my wallet. Ryan mentioned wanting a new laptop for school. I bought him a MacBook Pro. Mom complained about her old phone. iPhone 14 Pro Max under the tree. Dad needed new tools for work. $500 at Home Depot. I thought I was showing love. I thought this was how you proved you cared about family. The requests got bigger and more frequent. Ryan's tuition payments, $12,000 per semester that I'd been covering for 2 years. My parents' vacation to Mexico last summer. Just a small loan that turned into $4,000 I never saw again. Emergency car repairs, medical bills, home improvements. I was funding their entire lifestyle while living in a modest one-bedroom apartment and driving a 5-year-old Honda Civic. But the breaking point should have been 2 months ago, when I discovered that Ryan had been telling his college friends that our family was loaded because of my job. He'd been throwing parties at my parents' house, buying expensive alcohol, taking girls out to fancy restaurants, all on credit cards that I was ultimately paying off. When I confronted him about it, he laughed and said, "What's the big deal? You make good money." That phrase haunted me for weeks. You make good money. Not, "Thank you for helping us." Not, "We appreciate your generosity." But simply an acknowledgement that I had money, and therefore it was somehow my obligation to share it. I should have drawn the line then. I should have seen the red flags waving frantically in front of my face. 3 weeks ago, when I suggested a family trip to Colorado, just a simple weekend in a cabin, maybe some hiking, some quality time together without the constant undercurrent of financial transactions, my parents looked genuinely uncomfortable. Dad shifted in his chair and said, "Sweetheart, we need to be more careful with spending right now. Things are tight." Mom nodded sympathetically and added, "Maybe later in the year when our situation improves." I offered to pay for the entire trip. I suggested we could keep it budget-friendly, maybe camp instead of staying in a hotel, but they deflected every suggestion with vague excuses about work schedules and other commitments. I left their house that day feeling confused and a little hurt, but I told myself they were just being responsible about money. How naive I was. So when that Instagram notification popped up on my phone on a Tuesday morning in March, when I saw that photo of my entire family grinning like lottery winners against the backdrop of the Swiss Alps, my first emotion wasn't anger, it was confusion. The image showed everyone I considered my immediate family: mom in a designer ski outfit I'd never seen before, dad in an obnoxious bright red Patagonia parka that probably cost more than my rent, Ryan wearing a North Face jacket with the tags practically still visible, my cousin Jessica and her perpetually unemployed boyfriend Marcus, who somehow managed to afford matching Rossignol skis. The caption read, "Living our best life in Switzerland, just the close ones," followed by a heart emoji and hashtags about family and Swiss adventures. Just the close ones. I read those 4 words over and over until they burned themselves into my brain. I wasn't in that photo. I wasn't mentioned in that caption. I wasn't even tagged in the post. But most importantly, I had no idea this trip was even happening. My hands started shaking as I zoomed in on the photo, studying every expensive detail. The luxury ski resort in the background, I recognized it from travel magazines as one of those 5-star places that charge $1,000 a night. The professional ski equipment that none of them owned last week, the champagne glasses visible on the table behind them. This wasn't a budget vacation. This was the kind of trip I'd been dreaming about taking myself someday, when I could finally afford to splurge on something purely for pleasure. That's when my brain made the connection that my heart had been trying to avoid. 6 months ago, Dad had asked to be added to my emergency credit card. He'd painted this vivid picture of potential disasters. What if Mom had a medical emergency and they needed to get to a specialist in another state? What if their car broke down in the middle of nowhere? What if there was a family crisis and they needed immediate access to funds? Being the loving, trusting daughter I'd always been, I said yes without hesitation. After all, it was just for emergencies. They were responsible people. They would never abuse that trust. With my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, I opened my banking app. The loading screen felt like it took forever, and when the transactions finally appeared, I felt the blood drain from my face. The story was all there in black and white. 6 round-trip tickets from Denver to Zurich, $14,200. 4 nights at the Grand Hotel Kempinski in St. Moritz, $9,800. Ski equipment rentals for 6 people, $4,100. Private ski lessons, $2,500. Fine dining reservations at restaurants I could only dream of affording, $3,700. Helicopter tours, spa treatments, wine tastings, shopping excursions. Each transaction felt like a punch to the gut. The total came to $31,412. They had not only maxed out my emergency credit card's $30,000 limit, but they'd also triggered overdraft fees when they exceeded it. My emergency fund, the money I'd been saving for years in case I lost my job or had a real crisis, was completely wiped out. I sat there in my quiet apartment, staring at my phone screen, feeling like I was watching my entire life crumble in real time. These weren't emergency expenses. This was a luxury vacation that cost more than some people make in a year, and I was apparently the unwitting financier of their Swiss adventure. But the betrayal went deeper than just the money. They had actively excluded me. They had planned this trip, booked these reservations, packed their bags, and flew to another continent without so much as mentioning it to me. While I was working 60-hour weeks to afford their lifestyle, they were living it up in the Alps and posting about it on social media like they were celebrities. That's when Ryan's text message came through, and this is where the story gets really ugly. It was clearly meant for someone else, probably Marcus. LOL, can you believe Hallie has no idea we're using her card for all this? She's probably at home eating ramen and checking her bank account wondering where all her money went. This is the best vacation ever. I stared at that message until the words blurred together. The casual cruelty of it. The complete lack of guilt or shame. The way he was literally laughing at my expense while spending money I'd worked myself to exhaustion to earn. My own brother, the person I'd been supporting financially for years, was treating me like a joke. I typed back 3 words that would change everything. He just did. The response was immediate. My phone started buzzing with panicked calls from Ryan. Then Mom. Then Dad. I let every single call go to voicemail while I sat there processing the magnitude of what they had done to me. But here's what really broke my heart. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This trip required months of planning. They had to apply for passports, book flights, research hotels, coordinate schedules. For months, they had been planning this elaborate vacation while looking me in the eye and telling me money was tight. For months, they had been calculating exactly how much they could steal from me without me noticing. I spent the next 4 hours on the phone with my bank, my credit card company, and anyone else who would listen. I disputed every single charge. I reported the card as stolen, which it essentially was, since they were using it for purposes I never authorized. The customer service representative was incredibly helpful once I explained the situation and provided evidence that I wasn't part of the trip. Ma'am, since you have documentation proving you weren't included in this vacation, and since these charges far exceed what would be considered emergency expenses, we can reverse most of these transactions immediately, she explained. We'll also be canceling all associated reservations since the card has been reported as compromised. But I didn't stop there. They had used my travel rewards account to book everything. My frequent flyer miles that I'd earned through years of business travel. My hotel points. My rental car preferences. They had essentially hijacked my entire digital travel profile and used it as their personal vacation planning service. I systematically went through and canceled every single reservation, every single booking, every single luxury experience they had planned for the remaining 4 days of their trip. The private ski lessons scheduled for tomorrow morning? Canceled. The 5-star restaurant reservation for tonight? Gone. The helicopter tour they'd been bragging about on Instagram? Vanished. The spa appointments Mom had booked? Deleted. Even their return flights, since those were booked with my miles and my compromised card, were suddenly invalid. By the time I finished, it was 6 p.m. Denver time, which meant it was 1 a.m. in Switzerland. They would be discovering the cancellations throughout the next day, probably starting with their dinner reservation that evening. My phone continued buzzing with increasingly frantic calls and messages. Ryan's voicemails went from confused to panicked to angry. Mom's messages started calm and evolved into barely controlled hysteria. Dad's calls became increasingly demanding and hostile, but I wasn't ready to talk to them yet. I was still processing the fact that the people I loved most in the world had been systematically using and manipulating me for years. I was mourning the family I thought I had, while simultaneously preparing for the war I knew was coming. At 6:47 a.m., my time, when my phone had been buzzing nonstop for 12 hours, Dad finally got through. His voice was exhausted, stressed, but still carried that familiar tone of expectation. Hallie, we need $7,000 to get home. All our reservations got canceled, the hotel is kicking us out, and our return flights are invalid. I don't know what kind of mistake happened with your card, but you need to fix this right now. $7,000, just like that. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they'd done, no recognition that they'd stolen from me. Just an expectation that I would, once again, open my wallet and solve their problems. No, I said, and the word felt like the first honest thing I'd said to my family in years. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like forever. I hope you enjoy figuring out how to get home, I continued, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. You'll have plenty of time to think about what you've done. And Dad? Next time you want to take a family vacation, maybe try including the family member who's paying for it. I hung up and turned off my phone. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't going to rescue them. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to let them face the consequences of their own choices. The silence that followed hanging up on my father was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't jumping into action to solve their problems. I wasn't calculating how much money I could transfer, wasn't researching flights to get them home, wasn't crafting apology emails to hotels on their behalf. I was just sitting in my apartment, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: peace. But that peace was short-lived, because what I didn't realize was that cutting off their escape route in Switzerland was just the beginning. The real war was about to start when they got home. They somehow managed to scrape together enough money to get back to Denver. I later found out they had to sell Dad's vintage watch and Mom's wedding ring to a pawn shop in Zurich, plus borrow money from 3 different relatives with promises to pay back with interest. The journey home took them 2 days instead of their planned direct flight, involving a train to Paris, a budget airline to New York, and finally a red-eye to Denver. When they finally walked through their front door, they looked like refugees from their own greed. But instead of reflecting on what they'd done, instead of feeling shame or remorse, they were furious. At me. Somehow, in their twisted logic, I was the villain in this story. I was the one who had overreacted. I was the one who had embarrassed them internationally. I was the one who needed to make this right. The first sign that they had learned absolutely nothing came in the form of a group text message sent to our entire extended family. Mom had crafted this masterpiece of manipulation that painted me as an unstable, vindictive daughter who had abandoned her family in a foreign country over a simple misunderstanding. She described their harrowing journey home and asked for prayers and support during this difficult time caused by Hallie's irrational behavior. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with messages from aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends. Most of them fell into 2 categories: those who wanted to hear my side of the story, and those who had already decided I was the problem. My Aunt Patricia, who had always been my mom's closest ally, left me a voicemail that I'll never forget. "Hallie, honey, I know money can be a sensitive subject, but family comes first. Whatever happened between you and your parents, surely it can't be worth destroying your relationships over. They're devastated, and frankly, I'm disappointed in you." But here's what Patricia and the others didn't know. This wasn't about the Switzerland trip. This was about years of financial abuse that I was finally ready to expose. So I did something I'd never done before. I fought back. I created a detailed timeline of every financial transaction I'd made for my family over the past 5 years. Every tuition payment, every emergency loan, every temporary help with bills. I documented everything with bank statements, text message screenshots, and email chains. The total came to over $120,000. $120,000 that I had given freely, generously, without ever asking for a timeline for repayment, or even a simple thank you. I sent this documentation to Patricia and a few other family members who had questioned my behavior, along with a simple message: "Before you judge my reaction to a $31,000 theft, perhaps you should understand the full context of what I've been dealing with for years." The response was immediate and dramatic. Patricia called me within an hour, her voice completely different from the judgmental tone of her earlier voicemail. "Hallie, honey, I had no idea. Why didn't you ever say anything?" That question haunted me for days. Why hadn't I said anything? Because I thought this was normal. Because I thought this was what love looked like. Because I thought being a good daughter meant being an endless source of financial support. Because every time I even hinted at feeling used, they made me feel guilty for keeping score in a family relationship. But the documentation did more than just change a few minds. It started a revolution within our extended family. Cousins who had been quietly struggling with their own financial boundaries began speaking up. Uncle Mark admitted that Dad had been hitting him up for loans for months. Aunt Susan revealed that Mom had been asking to borrow her credit cards for emergencies. The picture that emerged was of a couple who had systematically manipulated every family member they could, always with sob stories, always with promises to pay back, always with guilt trips about family loyalty. While I was dealing with the extended family drama, I realized I had a much bigger problem brewing at home. Ryan's college tuition for the spring semester was due in 3 weeks, and for the past 2 years, I had been the one paying it. $12,000 per semester, plus room and board, plus his living expenses, plus his car insurance, plus his credit card bills when he inevitably overspent. I had been bankrolling his entire college experience while he treated me like a walking ATM and apparently entertained his friends with stories about my financial generosity. The old Hallie would have quietly continued making those payments, would have convinced herself that his education was more important than my hurt feelings, would have found a way to rationalize continuing to support someone who had so casually betrayed me. But the new Hallie, the one who had just canceled a $30,000 vacation and survived the aftermath, had a different idea. I logged into the university's payment portal and removed my credit card from Ryan's account. I disabled the auto-pay feature that had been quietly draining my bank account every semester. I updated his emergency contact information to remove my name. And then I called the financial aid office and informed them that I would no longer be providing financial support for Ryan Palmer, effective immediately. The woman on the phone was professional but clearly confused. "Ma'am, you're listed as his financial guarantor. If you're withdrawing support, he'll need to either pay the outstanding balance himself or apply for additional student loans. The current balance is $14,800, and payment is due in 18 days. $14,800, including late fees and interest that had been accumulating. Money I had been responsible for without even knowing it, because Ryan had been ignoring payment deadlines, assuming I would just take care of everything as usual. That's his responsibility now," I said, and the words felt like freedom. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. No panicked calls, no desperate texts, no acknowledgement that anything had changed. Ryan was either completely unaware that his financial safety net had been removed, or he was confident that I would cave at the last minute like I always had before. He was wrong. On the day the payment was due, I received a call from an unknown number. It was someone from the university's student accounts office. "Ms. Palmer, we're calling because the payment for Ryan Palmer's account has been declined, and the account is now past due. Since you're listed as the emergency contact and financial guarantor, we wanted to give you the opportunity to resolve this before we proceed with academic holds." "I'm no longer financially responsible for that account," I replied. "You'll need to contact Ryan directly." "Ma'am, we have a signed form indicating that you've accepted financial responsibility in case of non-payment. Unless you can provide documentation that this arrangement has been formally terminated, you remain liable for the debt." My blood ran cold. "I'd like to see that form, please." What arrived in my email 20 minutes later made me physically sick. There was my name, my address, my phone number, and what appeared to be my signature on a financial guarantee form. But here's the thing. I had never signed any such document. I had never even seen this form before. The signature was close to mine, but not quite right. The loops were too big, the slant was slightly off, and I never, ever dotted my I's with hearts the way this signature did. Ryan had forged my signature on a legal document, making me financially responsible for his education without my knowledge or consent. This wasn't just entitlement or poor financial boundaries. This was fraud. This was identity theft. This was a felony. I immediately called the university's fraud department and filed a formal complaint. I provided samples of my real signature, copies of my ID, and a detailed statement explaining that I had never authorized this guarantee. I also contacted my bank's fraud department and the police to file reports for identity theft and forgery. But I didn't stop there. I hired a lawyer. Meeting with attorney Sarah Chen was one of the most validating experiences of my life. She reviewed all my documentation, the forged guarantee form, the unauthorized credit card charges, the pattern of financial manipulation, and confirmed what I had been afraid to admit to myself. I had been the victim of systematic financial abuse by my own family. Hallie, she said, leaning forward across her desk, what your family has done to you constitutes multiple felonies. The forged signature alone carries a potential sentence of up to 5 years in prison. The credit card fraud could add another 3 to 5 years. If you wanted to pursue criminal charges, you would have an extremely strong case. The weight of that statement sat between us for several minutes. I had the power to send my own brother to prison. I had evidence that could destroy my parents' reputation and financial future. I held their fate in my hands the same way they had been controlling mine for years. What do you want to do? Sarah asked gently. That night, I drove to the one place that had always brought me clarity, my grandfather's house. Grandpa Joe was 83 years old, sharp as a tack, and had always been the moral compass of our family. If anyone could help me navigate this nightmare, it was him. I laid out the entire situation for him: the Switzerland trip, the forged documents, the pattern of financial abuse, the lawyer's recommendation to pursue criminal charges. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow, but never showing shock or surprise. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he got up, walked to his bedroom, and came back with a small wooden box I'd never seen before. He opened it and pulled out a deed. "This is for the cabin up at Lake Granby," he said, placing the document in my hands. "It's been in our family for 60 years. I always planned to leave it to your father when I passed. But after watching what's happened these past few months, I've changed my mind. I'm giving it to you now." I stared at the deed, unable to process what he was telling me. The cabin at Lake Granby was worth at least $300,000. It was prime Colorado mountain property with lakefront access, the kind of place families fought over in inheritance disputes. "Grandpa, I can't accept this. It's too much, and it's going to cause huge problems with Dad and the family." He smiled, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like someone was truly on my side. "Hallie, sweetheart, you're the only one in this family who's shown any integrity in the past decade. You're the only one who's worked for what you have instead of just taking from others. You're the only one who deserves it." He stood up and walked to the phone. "I'm calling my lawyer first thing tomorrow morning. This cabin is yours, free and clear, and I'm updating my will to reflect some other changes I've been thinking about." That conversation changed everything. Not because of the cabin, though that was an incredible gift, but because it confirmed that I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't the villain in this story. Someone who had watched our family dynamics for decades had reached the same conclusion I had. Enough was enough. When I got home that night, there were 17 missed calls and 43 text messages waiting for me. The university's payment deadline had passed, and Ryan's account had been frozen. No classes, no access to dorms, no meal plan, no student services. He was effectively expelled until the balance was paid in full. The messages started out confused and gradually escalated to panic, then anger, then desperation. But the one that really got to me was from Mom. "Hallie, please don't let your hurt feelings destroy your brother's future. We can work through this as a family, but only if you stop this vindictive behavior and pay his tuition. You're the only one who can fix this." That message encapsulated everything wrong with my family's mindset. My hurt feelings, as if systematic financial abuse was just a minor emotional inconvenience. As if forging my signature on legal documents was just a little family misunderstanding. As if stealing $30,000 for a luxury vacation was just a harmless prank. I turned off my phone and went to bed. For the first time in 2 years, I slept through the night without waking up in a panic about money or family drama, or whether I was doing enough to help the people I loved. The next morning, I had a single text message from Ryan. "Congratulations, Hallie. You've officially ruined my life. I hope you're happy." I read it twice, then deleted it. Because for the first time in 5 years, I actually was happy. The weeks that followed Ryan's final bitter text message were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't managing anyone else's crisis, wasn't juggling anyone else's financial emergency, wasn't losing sleep over someone else's poor decisions. The silence was profound, and honestly, it was beautiful. But that silence didn't last long, because my family wasn't going to go quietly into the night. What I had underestimated was their capacity for escalation, their willingness to burn down everything rather than accept responsibility for their actions. The real war was just beginning. It started with Dad showing up at my office. I was in the middle of a crucial presentation to potential investors when my assistant knocked on the conference room door. "Hallie, there's a man in the lobby saying he's your father and that it's a family emergency. He's being quite insistent." My heart dropped, not from concern, but from embarrassment. In front of my boss, my colleagues, and 3 potential clients worth millions of dollars, I had to excuse myself to deal with what I knew was going to be another manipulation tactic. Dad was pacing the lobby like a caged animal, his face red with anger and what looked like genuine desperation. When he saw me, he launched into what I can only describe as a public meltdown. "Hallie, what you're doing to this family is cruel and vindictive. Your brother hasn't been able to register for classes, he's living in his car because he can't afford his dorm, and your mother hasn't stopped crying for 3 weeks. This has gone far enough." I looked around the lobby at my coworkers, the security guard, random visitors, all staring at this middle-aged man having a breakdown in a corporate setting. The secondhand embarrassment was overwhelming, but what struck me most was his word choice. I was doing this to the family. Not that the family had done anything to me, not that there might be consequences for their actions, but that I was the aggressor in this situation. "Dad, you need to leave. This is my workplace, and you're causing a scene." "I'll cause whatever scene I need to cause until you come to your senses," he said, his voice getting louder. "Do you have any idea what you've put us through? We had to sell your grandmother's jewelry to pay back the relatives who helped us get home from Switzerland. We're behind on our mortgage because we don't have access to your emergency fund anymore. Ryan is failing out of school because of your petty revenge." That's when I realized something that changed everything. They still didn't get it. After everything that had happened, after all the evidence I'd provided, after the legal documents and the fraud charges and the clear boundaries I'd established, they still saw themselves as the victims. They still believed that my money was their money, that my financial support was their right, that my decision to protect myself was somehow an attack on them. Security eventually escorted Dad from the building, but not before he shouted loud enough for half the office to hear. "Your own family, Hallie! You're destroying your own family over money!" I spent the rest of that day fielding concerned questions from colleagues and trying to focus on work while processing the humiliation of having my personal drama displayed so publicly. But something had crystallized in that moment. This wasn't going to end with reasonable conversations or family meetings or therapy sessions. This was going to end with me making a choice. Either I could continue being their victim, or I could take control of my own narrative. That evening, I called attorney Sarah Chen and told her I was ready to pursue criminal charges. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, formal charges were filed against Ryan for identity theft, forgery, and fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged signature, the unauthorized financial guarantee, the pattern of deception documented in emails and text messages. The district attorney's office was particularly interested in the case because it represented a growing trend of financial abuse within families, something they wanted to address more aggressively. But the real turning point came when the investigation expanded beyond just Ryan. The credit card fraud from the Switzerland trip implicated both of my parents, and suddenly we were looking at a family-wide criminal conspiracy. The prosecution offered a plea deal: full restitution of all stolen funds, formal acknowledgement of guilt, community service, and probation. The alternative was felony charges that could result in prison time for all three of them. I expected them to take the plea deal. I expected them to finally face reality and accept responsibility for what they'd done. Instead, they hired a lawyer and decided to fight. Their strategy was as predictable as it was nauseating. They painted me as a vindictive daughter who was using the legal system to punish her family for minor financial disagreements. They characterized their theft as borrowing and claimed that I had given them permission to use my credit cards for emergencies. They argued that the Switzerland trip qualified as an emergency because Dad had been under stress from work and Mom needed a mental health break. The most painful part was watching them recruit character witnesses, aunts, uncles, family friends who testified about what a generous, family-oriented person I had always been, and how out of character this legal action seemed. They painted a picture of a loving family torn apart by one member's sudden greed and vindictiveness. But their lawyer made a crucial mistake. In trying to establish that I had a pattern of financial generosity, they inadvertently documented the extent of the abuse. Every generous gift, every family loan, every emergency payment I'd made over the years became evidence of systematic financial exploitation. What they meant to present as proof of my loving nature instead became a timeline of how they had been using me for years. The prosecution's case was devastating. They presented bank records showing over $150,000 in gifts and loans over 5 years, none of which had ever been repaid. They showed the forged documents, the unauthorized charges, the deliberate deception and planning that went into the Switzerland trip. Most damaging of all, they played recordings of voicemails my family had left during the Switzerland crisis, including one where Mom explicitly stated that they had planned the trip knowing I would eventually pay for it. But the moment that changed everything happened during Ryan's testimony. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor asked him to explain why he felt entitled to forge my signature on legal documents. "She always paid for everything," he said, his voice defensive and angry. "It wasn't like I was stealing from a stranger. She's my sister, and that's what family does for each other. She made good money, and we needed help, so I did what I had to do to make sure I could stay in school." The prosecutor pressed further. "So you believe that your sister's financial resources were available for your use without her explicit consent?" "She never said no before," Ryan replied, and I watched the jury's faces change as they heard those words. "She never complained about helping us. If she had a problem with it, she should have spoken up years ago instead of waiting until now to make a big deal about it." That testimony sealed their fate. In less than 3 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, delivered a sentence that surprised everyone. Instead of the maximum prison time the prosecution had requested, she ordered full restitution, 5 years of probation, and a permanent restraining order, preventing any of them from contacting me without my explicit written consent. "This court recognizes," she said, looking directly at my family, "that financial abuse within families is a serious crime that often goes unreported because victims feel guilt and obligation toward their abusers. The defendants in this case exploited those feelings systematically and shamelessly. The sentence reflects not just the monetary damages, but the profound breach of trust and the emotional harm inflicted on the victim. $153,412. That was the total amount they were ordered to pay back with interest. Money I had never expected to see again. Money I had written off as the price of loving a family that didn't love me back. But here's what I didn't expect. I didn't want it anymore. The money felt tainted now, connected to years of manipulation and abuse. Taking it back felt like accepting that their treatment of me had been a transaction, that love could be bought and sold, that family relationships were ultimately about financial exchange. So I made a decision that surprised everyone, including my lawyer. I donated the entire restitution amount to a nonprofit that helps people escape financial abuse situations. Every penny of it went to an organization that provides legal assistance, counseling, and emergency financial support to people who are trapped in exploitative relationships with family members, romantic partners, or caregivers. The donation made local news. Local woman donates 150K settlement to help other abuse victims. And suddenly I was getting calls from reporters, from other nonprofits, from people who wanted to share their own stories of financial exploitation. I realized that what I had experienced wasn't unique or even uncommon. There were thousands of people trapped in similar situations, afraid to speak up because society tells us that family comes first, that blood is thicker than water, that you should never give up on the people who gave birth to you. But here's what I learned. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't your real family. Sometimes the people who share your DNA are the ones who hurt you most. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away. 6 months after the trial ended, I drove to the cabin at Lake Granby that Grandpa Joe had given me. I hadn't been there since receiving the deed, partly because I'd been dealing with legal proceedings, but mostly because I wasn't sure I was ready to fully embrace the new life I was building. The cabin was perfect, rustic but comfortable, with a wraparound porch that looked out over the lake and mountains that seemed to stretch forever. I spent that first weekend cleaning, organizing, and slowly making the space my own. On Sunday evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset reflect off the water, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi, Hallie, this is Jessica, your cousin. I know we're not supposed to contact you, but I wanted you to know that I think you were right about everything. Marcus and I have been talking about what happened, and we realized that we were part of the problem. We're sorry for how we treated you, and we're proud of you for standing up for yourself. I hope someday we can have a real conversation about all of this." I read the message twice, then put my phone away without responding, not because I was angry, but because I wasn't ready yet. Maybe someday I would be open to rebuilding relationships with extended family members who had genuinely learned from this experience. But right now, I was focused on something more important: learning how to be happy without needing anyone else's approval or validation. Over the following months, I started spending most weekends at the cabin. I learned how to fish, how to maintain a fire in the old stone fireplace, how to find peace in solitude without feeling lonely. I started dating again, something I hadn't done seriously in years because I'd been too exhausted from managing everyone else's problems to have energy for my own romantic life. I met David at a hiking group, and when he asked about my family during one of our early conversations, I told him the truth, all of it. The years of financial abuse, the legal battle, the decision to cut contact completely. I expected him to be shocked or judgmental, to suggest that surely there must be a way to reconcile, that family relationships were worth fighting for no matter what. Instead, he said, "That must have taken incredible strength. I'm sorry you had to go through that, but I'm glad you got out." That response told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person he was and the kind of relationship we could build together. One based on mutual respect, clear boundaries, and the understanding that love should never feel like exploitation. A year after the trial, I received a letter from Ryan. It came to my office, not my home address, and the return address showed it was from a community college in Fort Collins. The letter was short. "Hallie, I know I'm not supposed to contact you, but I needed you to know that I finally understand what I did to you. I'm working 2 jobs and going to community college part-time, and it's hard. But it's also the first time in my life that I've had to take real responsibility for myself. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I'm not asking for money or help or anything else. I just wanted to say that you were right, and I'm sorry, and I hope you're happy. Ryan." I read the letter several times over the next few days. There was something different about the tone, something that suggested genuine remorse rather than manipulation. But I still didn't respond. Some bridges, once burned, don't need to be rebuilt. Some relationships, once poisoned, are healthier when they end. What surprised me most about cutting contact with my immediate family wasn't how difficult it was how easy it became. After the initial grief of losing the family I thought I had, after processing the anger and betrayal and disappointment, what remained was simply relief. I no longer dreaded phone calls or family gatherings. I no longer felt guilty about spending money on myself or saving for my own future. I no longer had to manage anyone else's emotions or crises or poor decisions. For the first time in my adult life, I was free to just be myself. 2 years later, I'm writing this story from the porch of my cabin, watching the sun set over Lake Granby. David is inside making dinner, and we're planning our wedding for next spring. A small ceremony with friends and chosen family, people who have earned their place in our lives through love and respect and reciprocity. Grandpa Joe passed away peacefully last month, and I was the only family member at his funeral. He had updated his will one final time, leaving his entire estate to me with a note that said, "To my granddaughter Hallie, who showed me that integrity isn't inherited, it's chosen." I still get messages occasionally from extended family members, usually around holidays, testing to see if I've gotten over what happened, if I'm ready to move on and rebuild relationships with my parents and brother. But here's what they don't understand. I have moved on. I've built a life filled with people who value me for who I am, not what I can provide. I've learned to recognize love that doesn't come with strings attached, relationships that don't require me to sacrifice my well-being for someone else's comfort. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how I handled the situation, if I wish I had tried harder to work things out within the family, if I miss them. The answer is complicated. Do I regret standing up for myself? Absolutely not. Do I regret that it was necessary? Of course. I grieve for the family I thought I had, for the relationships I hoped were possible, for the love I believed was unconditional. But I don't miss the anxiety, the financial stress, the constant feeling that I was never doing enough, the knowledge that my value to my family was measured primarily by my bank account balance. I don't miss walking on eggshells or making excuses for people who showed me repeatedly that they didn't respect me. Most importantly, I don't miss the person I was when I was trying to buy love from people who were never going to give it freely. The woman I am now, sitting on this porch, planning a future with someone who loves me without conditions, supporting causes I believe in with money I've earned, and saved without pressure to fund anyone else's lifestyle. This woman is stronger, happier, and more authentically myself than I've ever been. The price of that peace was everything I thought I knew about family, love, and loyalty. But it turns out that sometimes the most expensive things in life are actually the ones that cost you nothing. They just require you to stop paying for things that were never really yours to begin with. And sometimes walking away isn't giving up on family. Sometimes it's giving up on the illusion of family so you can find the real thing. This is my story of learning the difference between the two. And trust me, knowing the difference changes everything.